Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to my channel. My name is Ryan and today we're going to be making this beautiful centerpiece or serving tray using epoxy resin. If you've ever used this before, it's pretty cool stuff. So let's head out to the garage and let me show you how it's done. All right, epoxy, it does this. If you've ever seen a kind of a glass-like surface on a table or something, that's what we're gonna be doing in this video, but we're not gonna be doing a tabletop. We're gonna take this old piece of wood, I bought this at a local store, and we're gonna be transforming it into a centerpiece or a serving tray. And so I'm gonna get my orbital sander out and just kind of mount this thing down, and yeah, I'll have to move these in just a minute. Get it nice and smooth. By the way, welcome to the channel. Do lots of home projects around the house, saving you time and money. Click that subscribe button. I put out videos regularly. Like this video and share this with somebody that you know. And if you want to make your own YouTube channel and turn your hobbies into real cash every month, check out my course. You can click the link in the description below. And that means both sides, get all those sharp burrs and whatnot out of there. Now this is a pretty good piece of wood. There's a big split in the middle that's going to give me some trouble. I'll explain that in a minute. As far as supplies, we've got a bucket, we've got some plastic. You see my sawhorse is there, not necessary except during the sanding process. I'm going to be doing most of my pouring of the epoxy on the actual bucket. We've got some shims here to level things out, and here is the actual epoxy. We've got part A and part B, and you can see it's quite thick and viscous, so we're going to be soaking it in some nice warm water here, and that will make it, again, a little less thick and less viscous. So as that is warming up, I let it sit in warm water for 30 minutes or so. I am going to be taping. We've got a big crack, as I mentioned, on the right through the middle. It's a significant crack, and that is of concern to me. So we're going to be flipping it over on the underside, taping it up a little bit, because on our first pour of the epoxy, we basically want it to create enough of a plug so that we can get most of that really deep crack covered in our epoxy. We've also got a small crack right there, and I'm going to tape the underside as well. And I'm going to tape the side too up a little bit, as high as possible, so that it doesn't flow out. Now this is the first time I've done a piece of wood like this before, so we're going to learn from my mistakes, or hopefully this can help you avoid my mistakes. Next, we've got 3 pieces of plastic, the actual cups. We're going to label them A, B, and C, and we're going to put a little mark on those. I'll explain that in a minute. We need a respirator and some glasses because we want to be safe while we're doing this. Now, cup A is going to contain part A, and you want basically 1-to-1 ratio. You'll want to read the instructions on your specific epoxy. I'll put links down below for this stuff and other recommendations that I have, but read the instructions really well. For the most part, it's a 1-to-1 ratio, at least in my case here. So we're going to pop open the top, and we're going to pour an equal part of part A into cup A, just like this. You can see I've got the line indicating when I should stop the pour. And this stuff is pretty thick, so it's easy to over pour, so be careful there. You want it to come right up to the line. And remember, this stuff's been soaking, so it should be more, I wouldn't say watery, but less thick versus if you didn't soak it beforehand in warm water. Next, we'll take part B while part A settles in the cup. We'll take part B out of the bottle here, unscrew the top, and we're going to fill that into cup that's labeled B to the indicated line, which is the exact same line on cup A. Again, we want a 1-to-1 ratio. If you distort that at all, that could affect the curing time and the clarity and whatnot. So don't even mess around. You want it to be pretty much exact. So with both of those poured in equal amounts in their respective cups, we're going to take part B and part A, and we're going to pour it into part C. Now, could you pour part A into part B cup? Yeah, probably. I don't really see a problem with that. But I'm going to help maximize the chances that equal parts are being poured in. So you can see here, I'm scooping it out with my wooden, I need like a little rounded wooden tool. And again, links in the description below for all the supplies you need, so don't stress out. Where do I get that? Where do I get that? We're going to kind of scoop as much as we can out of that. And we'll do the same thing with part B. And if you do it this way, that I think will maximize the chances of things falling into cup C in equal amounts. Whereas opposed to if you just put cup A into cup B, well, you're going to have more in cup B and maybe less in cup A because you can't really get everything out of cup A, if that makes sense. And what we're going to do next is just stir this calmly and gently. Manually, you're not going to use an electric stirrer or mixer or anything like that because we want to minimize bubbles. Now I've got a little heater here, a little portable heater. And if you don't have one of these, you can stand in front of a vent. If you've got a heater, turn on your heater and your AC HVAC system. Helps kind of release some of the bubbles, I think, and helps it stay thin as opposed to thick, which helps with the pour and the spreadability, etc. And we're going to do that for like 3 minutes, at least on this epoxy. The instructions say, stir this for 3 minutes. Now watch this. Check this out. This is pretty cool. With it thoroughly mixed, and we're not, even if we see bubbles, we're not going to worry about that quite yet. Now this is just the base coat too, it's important to say. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but our job here is to seal the top part of this piece of wood on the first pour. Don't worry too much about the sides or certainly not the underside. You can't access that right now, but that's our job right now. And I'm going to get most of it poured on. And then I have this little plastic tool piece. This is really cool. I love this piece. And we're just going to spread. You can see it kind of drinking up. The darker color there means it's being spread over that area of the wood. Lighter color means it has not obviously touched, the epoxy has not touched that part of the wood yet. And so I'm using the flat surface so far, and I'm just, so there's a trowel or a notched edge of various lengths on each side of the square tool that I'm using. I'm just using the solid flat tool at this point for my base coat. And I'm just making sure that all that color turns from the light color to a darker color, ensuring, hey, this epoxy has indeed made contact with this area of the wood and it is considered covered. And I'm not going to worry about it spilling off the edge at all. In fact, that'll help coat the sides of this piece of wood. And if it, cures in a very weird way, I can just sand that down, no problem, a little later, which I'll get to. You'll certainly see me do that in the next step here. But you're looking at real live, so I'm not, time lapsing this or changing the speed. This is me, authentic video, the first pour, and kind of what that looks like. So not too bad, right? If you've never done epoxy before, it's surprisingly simple. I think it stresses, or at least it intimidated me a lot before I, had done or had any experience with epoxy. But it's pretty simple. You want to make sure there's no airflow in the room for about 24 hours. So if you're going to do this in the garage and you have kids that need to, access their bike, well, guess what? You have to get that bike out of there, right? And so you're going to have airflow happening when you open that garage. I used the garage when my kids were, and it was kind of cooler, not cold, but cooler weather. So I knew they weren't going to be riding their bikes. Kids were at school, so I was able to take advantage of that. So I did this in the morning hours, all day at school. And I just said, hey, no bikes after school. And then after about a week, I was still, playing around with this, and I ended up having to go into the basement. So you need to think about, where you're going to do this. No interruptions, no airflow happening, because that can blow little dust particles in while it's drying, and it will stay wet for quite, several hours. How many? At least 8, I would say, maybe 12 before it finally starts to, harden a little bit, and then 24 before you can really pick it up or touch it. So just a little tip there. And again, I'm continuing to work this in here with the tool that I have, making sure that this is the base coat here. So you really want to work it in and try to get all those gaps at least one time. Don't worry about perfection, but you need some good coverage of the gaps, meaning everything doesn't have to be perfectly smooth. We're going to be adding other layers to this, but we want some good coverage here for this first base coat. So I'm kind of wiping that off. All right, I think I'm pretty happy with that. Now, I'm going to take a brush, and this is, get a packet of these little foam brushes, really handy, because not only can it help you paint into specific area, paint the epoxy onto like the sides, for example, but it can also help you wipe away some of the drippings that happen on the underside, because this stuff goes on pretty thick and it's going to kind of pour over the side, and it's going to cure and dry into think like a smooth icicle, right? On the underside of the wood. And you can minimize that if you're smart about it. Take a foam brush before it dries and wipe the underside would be kind of another tip here. Now you could see my big gap. This is going to cause me some problems throughout this process, but you can see it's starting to leak out. So I didn't tape it high enough and I didn't tape it strong enough. So I've got a brace there. There's a piece of wood to the left you can see in the picture that's actually pushed up and holding that piece of tape up, because the gap is so big. There's quite a bit of volume in there of epoxy and it's kind of bursting out. And so that's what that is. I just filled it up and it's, not even quite yet, but that's okay. I'll add to it a little later. And I'm just brushing the edges here a little bit and making sure there aren't any huge, bumps underneath those round icicles, smooth icicles underneath. Here's a better view. I'll change angles for you, so you can see how nice and clear and smooth that is on my first pour. There's another look of the brush that can kind of wipe away some of those drips that are forming underneath. Now we're not going to worry about pushing out a lot of the bubbles at this point if there are any bubbles. I've got a kind of a needle-like tool. If I see any hairs or furs or something in the air that has, landed on, I can gently pick this up while it's still wet. And this is self-leveling epoxy, so now if you do this an hour later, it's not going to work at all. But it's self-leveling. You've got about 20 to 30 minutes or so before it starts hardening up on you or giving you problems. So should be plenty of time. My recommendation is to go as fast as you can. So don't mess around too much once you pour it. You can see we're pretty good here. There's those bubbles or those smooth icicles underneath. Got lots of waste, which I'll be disposing of later. All right, now it's touchable. So it's been about a full day, 24 hours, same time next day I come back out here and things are dried up. So I'm gonna pull this thing off, and that's kind of gonna give me some trouble, but that's okay. Again, this is just the base coat. This is not the finished coat. You can see I've got my tape still, that huge gap, the gash in the wood I need to figure out. I need to sand those icicles down. I'll just call them icicles for this video. Why not? So we're gonna go ahead and get rid of that tape. And if you wait a full 24 hours, it will give you problems to get rid of that tape. If you can take it off around, I don't know, maybe like hour 12, once it's not completely, but dry and not sticky or tacky anymore, the tape removal will be easier. Otherwise, you have to kind of pick away at the tape because the epoxy has cured around it, and you got to kind of dig it out. And that's okay. Again, this is just our base coat, not a problem. We'll be sanding this down, and we still have the undercoat to take the underside to take care of here as well. Now, do you want to seal the entire piece of wood? I definitely recommend it, because if any part is unsealed, that could possibly absorb moisture into your wood, and moisture in wood is a bad thing. So don't think that, hey, I can just seal the top and be good because nobody will see the underside. I recommend you seal the entire thing. Again, you don't want wood swelling and your epoxy splitting because there was penetration happening from moisture in the air. So we've got it turned over now, and we're smoothing out all those icicle pieces that had formed on the underside with the orbital sander. And I've got about a 120 grit sandpaper on there. You can kind of work with anything from 120 to 240, 220, I think will be fine. And I've got my multi-tool sander as well for some of those more hard to reach areas. And look at that. It's a beautiful first, no bubbles at all. I didn't even have to use a lighter to blow out, get those bubbles out. Nonetheless, we are going to destroy the surface a little bit. Don't freak out. This is normal. We're going to take our orbital sander, and with a 220 grit, we are going to lightly polish. Now, if you do this too soon, you're going to give yourself a huge headache because it's going to create these unsightly gashes on the epoxy top. This thing, once it's fully cured, it will dust off the top, which is what you want. You want like a cloudy, iridescent almost surface. And you're kind of thinking, well, why would I do that? Well, we're going to try to buffer out any of the inconsistencies that have happened, any bubbles, and we're going to be applying our next coat here. So we'll warm up the part A and part B, and we'll make sure everything's level, and we'll bring things out here. And we are going to get that underside coated. You could do the top side. I don't see a problem with, doing 2 coats of top side first and then the underside, but we'll kind of we'll try to keep things even here. In other words, 1 coat on the top side for 1 coat on the underside in kind of equal parts. You don't have to do that. That's probably overkill. I think 1 base coat on the bottom will be fine. Like I said, keep that moisture out. And then your top coat might need 2 or 3 different layers depending on what kind of challenges you have with your coating process. So here we are, the back side, the underside of the piece of wood. And kind of the same thing as we did with the top side. We've got some more contours though. You can see it's it's kind of got some cut wood that's nice and smooth. And then some of that bark side piece, look at that. It's really dense and thick. And so we definitely want a layer of epoxy over all of that. And so make sure that you measure enough part A and part B to provide good coverage for that. And again, you're going to get smooth icicles happening on the underside, which is now the top side of the piece of wood, right? And so we'll have to sand those off later as well. So it's kind of a game of sanding off the top side and the underside of these smooth icicles that drip down while the epoxy is curing. And I'll give you some more tips a little later on how I finish this without any of those smooth icicle bumps on either side. So here I am with the smooth side plastic tool, just pushing that stuff, pulling it over all of the raw wood. And you can see it change color there as it hits. And it really makes that grain pop. It's something I haven't mentioned yet. This is beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And, obviously if you're watching this video, you are interested in epoxy and you probably know, hey, epoxy makes it, have this beautiful finish. But what does that really mean? I think the epoxy makes those colors and the contrast of colors really pop, and look how beautiful it is. I mean, you can just look yourself. There's no words to describe that. It goes from this kind of pale raw wood color to some deep yellows and some deep browns that just look beautiful together. So I'm going to pour a little bit. You can see yes, you need new cups every time. You got to label it every time because the old stuff is going to be not good anymore. So you got to throw that away. Now, you want to Google how to dispose of your part A, B, and C cups because especially part C, if you have rags or brushes, foam brushes, or the cup here, it actually creates heat, and it does have the possibility of starting on fire. So you want to Google that and be really careful about how you dispose of that. I like to let my stuff dry completely and then dispose of it, as opposed to putting wet rags, especially with part C, right, the A and B mixed, in the garbage together, especially all wadded up where there's no airflow to it. That is, I think, some recipe for bad news. So keep that in mind as you are doing this and, you know, working with this stuff. Keep things open, lots of airflow, let things dry before you dispose of them. So here I am brushing it on. I just poured it. Now I've got that foam brush that I mentioned earlier, and here you can really work it in, and you can be thick. I mean, don't hold back. You want it to be, don't worry about drips too much. You can sand all that down later. Get thick, get down, get dirty with it. You want a solid base coat coverage that, you know, takes care of, that basically seals the entire piece of wood. And by the way, this wood cost me about $7 or so at the local store. Not too bad. All right, so here it is. It's drying the underside, and it is now dry. So I can touch that, and you can kind of see what that looks like. Definitely a high gloss finish. And you could kind of walk away and leave it like that, depending, though, on your top coat. Because if your top coat is not good, you might need to put more top coat on, thus creating drips on the undercoat that you might need to redo. So we've got some bumps on the top coat now. We've got this deep gash here that's filled. We've got a good base coat on, but not completely level. So I'm going to take care of that right now. So here we are. We're going to take it out to the sanding station, and I'm going to sand down that top coat again. We did that a little earlier, but I'm just going to make sure everything is nice and smooth. All those smooth icicles are out of there and level. I've got a new batch of part A and part B mixed into the cup labeled C, and we're going to work it in there again. And I'm going to specifically focus on making sure that epoxy is filling that gap. And it's a little hard to eyeball, okay, what's level, what's not, what will drip out, what will not. So I recommend making sure that you tape high enough the first time to make sure that epoxy stays in there and doesn't drip out or over your tape. By the way, we're going to be taking care of some bubbles on our second coat here. We need a lighter. Now you can get a butane torch and Google, you know, best thing. But I like this lighter. It's cheap and it gets the job done. You can see my technique here. Once I have a fresh coat poured, immediately I take my lighter and I ignite it and put a little bit of flame on over each bubble. Now look at the up-down action. You don't want to hold it in place too long because that will discolor or burn your epoxy, and that's no good. We're going to get most of the bubbles out. It doesn't have to be perfect again, but do that and orient it so that there's lots of light shining on it. Now you can see here I had to retape this big gash. I bulked up the tape a little bit, and also right here I see a little bit of, for whatever reason, the epoxy didn't get into that area. So it's dry, and I'm putting another batch on, and I'm concentrating in those areas specifically for the moment. I'll sand that down if there's you know, any irregularities, but I just need to make sure that everything is coated and even. It's better to have things built up too high than too shallow when you're dealing with gaps. So let's take off the tape. Now it's not completely dry yet, and that's okay. Kind of lift that up there. Still a little sticky, but it's not gushing out. So it's dry enough, and here it is 24 hours later. Pretty even, thus taking care of that major gap. I'm happy with that. So now the game continues. We're going to sand it down, and I've got 220 on here. Nice and smooth. You can tilt the orbital sander if you've got some angles here. And we'll do the bottom side as well. And we're going to bring it down to the basement. I'm in the basement now, not the garage, because my kids are, you know, outside riding their bike. So I've gotten the boot. You're not allowed in the garage anymore. The kids have to play. And here we go. Another top coat with the lighter. Get all that bubbles out. Very clear top coat. Very happy with that. However, the underside now needs to be sanded down. And I'm going to show you my little trick here. So the game of, sanding both sides has to end at some point, right? In other words, you have to pour a final coat and everything has to be good. You have to be able to walk away from it with no more further sanding. So let's sand down the underside one last time. And we're pretty even. Make sure I'm happy with all of that. Everything I think looks good. Just feeling with my finger to make sure there are no snags or burrs. We'll bring it down here after we clean it off. And yeah, you of course clean it off every time. And instead of pouring the final undercoat, the final coat on the underside, we're going to take the foam brush and we're going to put it on not thin, but pretty thickly. You can pour it, sure, or you can do this. And we're going to brush it on. Now there's going to be more bubbles when you do that. So you're going to need a little more focus with your lighter or your butane torch to get those bubbles out. But look at that. That's going to avoid the smooth icicles forming on the underside once it cures and we turn it over. So use a foam brush for your final coat, and I think that will help you. So we'll get all those bubbles burned out. Get it nice and smooth for the most part and let that dry. And check this out. When we're all done, we've got a beautiful, clear, bubble-free top coat on this centerpiece. We've got one kind of divot there. I don't know what happened there. But for the most part, I'm happy with that. I don't think people can see that. 99, 95% good. It's not 100%, but I'm calling it a win. So hopefully this has helped you out. Thanks for being with me.